All right, welcome. Let's begin. Welcome back to our game. Last we left off, you were defending the town against the evil Hydra and some golems in the background, waiting to attack next. The Hydra has been rampaging the town and is heading towards the castle. However, you and your companions will not let them happen as you make your last stand. And to help keep our battle map elevated, I have some little pikes to help hold it up, as well as some dice over here on the side for rolling. With that said, let us begin. So for my scene, I decided I wanted the fog to be a fade in, fade out. So as you can see now, we have our real scene showing up, as well as what I think is personally the best angle in my scene, especially with that fade effect. I think it looks really satisfying. But onto the actual scene over here, where our skybox is, it is our scene itself. So here we have our scaled up variant with our lighting. Got some point lights over here highlighting the golems, as well as some breath attack fire from the Hydra with different spotlights. A healing spotlight, which is representing a healing spell being casted by our friendly neighborhood cleric over here. And then we have our ice wizards casting different ice spells. One of them is using a ice block to impede the Hydra's movement, while the other one is casting a ice ball to chill the dragon out. And that is my scene. Let me reset my scene and fade out. I'm really happy with how this one turned out. So as for how I actually accomplished this, I ended up focusing on, before I actually discuss how I ended up handling this, let me discuss the graphic objects because that is how everything worked. So graphic objects are encapsulations of models and their associated attributes. So we have a graphic object color would be responsible for the shader, the model, the color, and its world. So for this, we have it set up so you can set colors either individually by specifying with mesh, or to set them all to be the same color. And then when it's time to render, it will render every mesh at once. This is so that we can help diversify our models for models with multiple meshes, giving them different colors to make them pop out better, while also cleaning up our draw scene so we don't have to have 30 lines of code to render one model. We can just say render model, and then it will do everything inside the graphic object. Texture is the same thing, but instead of color, we set up textures, and color light and texture light are the same as their non-light variants. However, they also have to handle having to deal with materials. So everything is created exactly the same, but now we have to worry about materials for them. So for color light, it's that, and the material represents the color of the object. So when it's time to render, we render with each mesh material. Textures, we set each texture to resource sampler and render with the material. And those are how the graphic objects work for my assignment. As for how the actual assignment went, for starters, we'll discuss the rasterizers. Though the different rasterizers aren't shown in my scene, I thought it was important to highlight it just because it was a useful debugging tool, where I set a rasterizer to be exclusively for wireframe. And this allowed me for when I wanted to try and get the radius of the spotlight, or get the location, or radius of the point light, excuse me, or the location of a point or spotlight, I was able to just set it up like that, and then it would show the scene properly. As for the next thing was creating the scenery itself. So we have the terrain and the skybox, as well as the ruined house and castle. So all of these use text-like trios, or quads, because I had to add more than 3 lights for my scene. And I created these subsets of functions to try and make my init demo a bit easier to pan through. And after I ended up creating all of these, I had the table and the pedestals to hold up the terrain, and their non-light variants. Okay, and then after that, it was time to demonstrate the heroes. So for that, it was creating the wizard as well as their attacks, followed by the warrior and their weapon, and then their mini variants. Finally, we had the enemies, which include the Hydra and the Golem, as well as their mini variants. The mini variants, to try and showcase the non-light graphic objects working as intended, all of them do not use any lighting. So all of them are outside the scene without light, but because they don't need light, it doesn't get affected by that. Then finally, you have the actual starting of the demo. So these are the parameters I used to help set up my mini scene, we have the offset of the mini scene, as well as some fog parameters that I ended up messing with in the update scene, which I'll get to soon. We have the initialization of all my shaders, as well as all the necessary model functions I talked about. And then finally, we have our point lights and directional lights. This point light represents where the ice ball starts. However, in the draw scene, it will get moved. And then we have our different directional lighting, followed by the static point lights in the text light shader. This is where the golems are all standing. And then we have our initial parameters for the fog to make it so that you cannot see the scene until you use special keybinds. And then after that, we set ourselves to the ideal scene position. Next up, for the start scene, we have the keybinds for B and F. This helps mess with our fog parameters so that when we hit B, it is time to show our real scene. And when we say F, we want to hide the real scene. I set up different camera speeds to try and highlight different the different side scales of the scene to help make it move faster. As for the actual fog shenanigans, we have whenever we begin combat, the fog will slowly increase in its start range. Because this increases, it gives the effect of the fog dissipating and leaving the scene. And then the fog increases as well, just to help with the transition a bit more. And once they both reach the actual parameter I want them to be, I set them static to try and get rid of some floating point error rounding. And then set this to false so that it doesn't keep spamming this if statement. And then finally, we set the fog parameters to be what we want them every time to do the fading. Then when it's time to end it, we do exactly what we did before, but in reverse. So now we're subtracting instead of adding. And once they reach 0, we set this to false so it doesn't spam the function. As for how we moved things in the actual scene itself, such as the ice ball, it reflected the idea of how we did move the debug cube with our light texture, with our light demos, where we rotated it around the y-axis. Instead, I have it moving constantly towards the Hydra. And when it gets to where the Hydra is, it will be quote-unquote hit. So the ice ball will be despawned. And the way I despawn it is I move it beyond the far clip plane and I have it move the opposite direction. This also helps me deal with a timer, which I finagled with a bit but couldn't get working properly. And then once we get back to the wizard's position, we set the ice ball's movement to go forwards and move it to where I had the offset of his hand. And that is everything for update. And then we have the key state for me to always get back to my perfect positioning. Onto how this actually rendered. I'm going to minimize these for later. For the actual draw scene, we had to create the lights that move. So all these two lights are based off of the ice ball's position. So that's to try and give the ice ball a glow effect. While also we have the spotlights for the Hydra over here, managed by the breath weapon attack, which I actually just realized I didn't talk about. So for the breath weapon attack, the way that the breath worked is the breath is based off a Boolean to determine which direction it needs to go. If it needs to move backwards, it will subtract this number, and if it needs to move forwards, it will add this number. So I have an oscillating function over here with true and falses. For when it reaches the designated position, it will change directions. And the same thing, I do the same thing for the healing beam, but the only difference is the healing beam, I change the Y value as well as the movement it does. And back to the actual draw scene. So with that in mind, by changing the vector over here to be the breath weapon, it gives the effect of the fire breath going outwards and inwards, almost as if it's trying to do a line attack kind of. And then the healing, it's just I end up having it always face down towards the soldiers, and then I have it move across them slowly. Once that's done, it is time to render everything. So we set them to context. First, the color light, we set that to context and render everything with color light as well as setting its parameters. This render wizards function, because I didn't do any hardware instancing, this instead manages all the wizards. So I have the color for the cleric because it has different clothing than the normal wizards, and I render that. Afterwards, I have my normal wizards rendered with different colors and materials, and that's the same feel for all of the other ones that I'll get to again. where to try and save space in the draw scene, I condense the rendering of multiple of the same object. So after that, we have the attack and the Hydra. Once we're done with that, we move on to the shader light. All the things with multi-light textures. So we set that, we set the matrix. I went to the skybox first to try and help get it across that we don't care about lighting for the skybox. And then after that, we have our terrain, ice, and everything else. And we have our golem and soldier, which if I move to those, like similarly to what I had with the wizard, it's all of the models that are rendered at the same time, but with offsets. So for the wizards, I only offset the translation matrix, the translation aspect of the matrix. For the golem, I changed the rotation as well, so that they were always facing towards the party. And the final part would be the wizards the soldiers, excuse me, over here, which had semi-parented objects. So the warrior and the warrior weapon are related to each other, where if I were to scroll back up, the warrior the warrior weapon is relative to the warrior matrix itself. So that way, when I change the warrior, the weapon will follow suit, except for the extra offset I need to do. So after that, we have temp setups. This temp setup allows me to change their positioning without actually altering the main function, which means that I can always default back to it each frame. So then this is all the warrior stuff. And then the small variants, which I'll just quickly show off, they're coming up next anyway. Small variants are the same thing as the original, but scaled down and shifted slightly differently, just for the tiny scene. And the last thing to discuss is the small world, right? Yeah, small world. So the small world uses the non-light textures to try and show the graphic objects without light. And so we have first the color light, all the color stuff over here, and then all the textures right over here. And that is everything in my scene.